remember feeling my cells vibrating. They were like vibrating rapidly. And it was as though the cells were aware of this light and were thirsty for the light too. And it was really strange because I felt myself feeling that thirst, but I also felt myself feeling it as all parts of my body, all my cells. I felt all of that. So anyway, I went into the light as like most people would describe it. And when I was in the light, I was overwhelmed by everywhere. There were all of these individual beings. And I knew them. I actually felt like I knew every one of them.
Hello, Franco. Finally, we are here. We can talk. We've been scheduling this for a couple of months now, so I'm very glad to see you, my friend.
Likewise.
And, and we're going to talk about your near-death experience, about your, about your clairvoyance, etc. I have an accent, so if you don't understand something, just ask me again. I'm from Eastern Europe.
Yeah, no problem.
Now, you asked me about how did I decided to do this kind of videos.
Yeah, so I was just I've always been intrigued myself to know what motivates somebody like you. You have such a prolific background in films and whatnot. I was thinking to myself, what got Sergei to get interested in something like this? And then you were telling me about your friend and his experience. And so my question was, did he have that experience, that out-of-body experience, as a result of his near-death experience? Or did he have a near-death, or was it just something that happened to him randomly?
Well, very good question, Frank. And I'm going to if you ask me, I'm going to give a little bit of background here. Yes,
Okay.
I was in the film business for a long time. And then I kind of, stepped out of it. And, but we always have this desire to create, right? Something to create. Photography, painting, maybe building a house, planting some trees. We always have the desire to create because God creates through us. That's my understanding.
Yep.
Last year, I met a friend of mine in Moldavia. I'm from Moldova, Eastern Europe. And I was there visiting, and we've been talking. He said, you know what? I had out-of-body experience or near-death experience. I don't exactly remember how, because in Russian it's different.
Yeah.
I said, wow, that's interesting, because I've been into this spiritual stuff for a while, Can you tell me more? He told me the story, and then I said, you know what, let's check it out. We got in the car, we went to that same hospital where he got this experience, and he showed me everything, and I took my camera and I got an interview. And I placed that interview on YouTube in Russian, and it was so popular. I mean, everybody, good comments, like 99% of people were very positive and say, I had this experience too. My son this, there was a big conversation over there.
Yeah.
And I got interested, and I started watching the videos myself, YouTube videos about near-death experience. And it was amazing. I said, what? I can't believe this. and I just caught me. It's not I can't believe this. I believed it.
Yeah.
I believed it. Because you have to be prepared for this kind of material.
Oh, you bet.
You have to be ready. You know how they say, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And it doesn't have to be a teacher. It may be a book. It may be a video. It may be like my friend, showed up.
Yeah.
And then I say, and after that I say, you know what, let me do some interviews too, because this is fascinating. And I created this a couple months ago. I've done this little website I have. It's called About Freedom Show, aboutfreedom.show.
Yeah.
And I started interviewing people. And here you are my guest number 15, I believe. But I only posted 3 of those. But I'm getting editing right now in August, because I'll go home and I will have a lot of time over there. I'll be editing that. So back to your story, my friend.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, because it's always, like I said, it's always fascinating to hear why people decide to create these kind of shows for us to speak about these topics. I really feel that people are trying to remember something about who they are, and these stories help them to do that. So it goes much deeper than just an understanding of what might be on the other side.
Exactly, the remembers. Remembrance. I'm not sure if I
Yes,
pronounce it right, but I felt in my life many times like I see something or I feel something. It's a remembrance. I'm not learning it again. Say, oh my gosh, I knew this,
yes.
and it's a remembrance all the time. And people are thirsty for this information, as you said.
Extraordinary amount of
Yeah,
people.
yeah,
And I think there are some places, many places still in the world that are just now starting to to get this information, be introduced to these topics. I mean, there's still a huge amount of people here, even in the United States, that they still need to remember. Let's just put it
yeah.
that way. But there's such a desire now for this. 5 years ago, maybe a little bit. 10 years ago, well, I don't know. You mean, but now it seems like everybody wants to remember.
Correct,
So
correct.
it's
Yeah,
cool that you have this show to help people to
yeah,
do that. And it's not surprising that in Russia that video, that interview blew up and
yeah,
it became so well
yeah.
viewed.
Yeah, this guy, I spoke today to him, and I'm sending him updates. How many views, how many. That's so many questions, and people are talking to each other. And I say, you got to get on that thread and start responding because they're asking me, what is this guy doing? What is wrong? I'm not I have no time to answer all that. But
Oh man, yeah,
yeah,
I know that just in the time that I've been doing interviews, I've been overwhelmed with people wanting
yeah,
to ask questions and to remember and needing assistance to get them to a place where they can start to remember. It's been a fascinating experience to say the least.
yeah, because this is something. It's not the temporary stuff here. We can feel it all that it's all temporary. This is not the end. Everybody feels that. This is not, it cannot be this the end here. All this
No,
craziness around, we're confused for 80 years or whatever, and then we go somewhere else. It's crazy. But people who are looking for the infinite, they want to know the truth. Something there, and this is why they are thirsty for this material.
yeah, I spent a lot of time, Sergey, talking about my near death experience, which is cool. I mean, it really is. I mean, I spent my whole life trying to make sense of it, to explain it to myself so I could someday explain it to others. And there's a lot of good messages in the story itself. But what I'm finding more and more and more fascinating is what I've done with that experience afterwards and all the information that I can share because of the clairvoyance that I now have as a result of that. And it's just astounding. It's astounding to receive this information and then to share it. And in some cases it's very new, the way that I'm receiving it, very new in terms of the way the message is being received by people. Um, and to your point, it's not going away. This is the beginning of a massive, massive awakening
Exactly. Yeah.
um, that humanity is going through. And you could reference different sacred books and religions about it, but the way I tell people, it's this is it. This is the big show. It's not about waiting anymore. We're here. This
Mhm.
is now everything that we've been waiting to experience, this thing that will happen someday. That thing is now.
Yeah.
It's
This
right
is a
now.
big awakening right now. You're right. It's a big wave, and people who are ready for this, even who are not ready, they are catching up all this. Like in the old spiritual books, it says that this is the end of Kali Yuga, which was the worst yuga for the world, one of the worst one, the beginning of, I believe, Dwarapa Yuga, or I might be mistaken the name of it, but it's another yuga starting. New
Hmm.
age, we can somebody call it new
Yep.
age, but yeah. So this is why this big mass awakening, and you're right, like 10, 15 years ago, I mean, 20 years ago, people would say you're crazy and
Uh-huh.
you got, it's hallucination and you took some drugs and stuff like that. But I've been reading the comments from my video, Russian video, and like people are just sharing great stories about everybody.
Yeah.
They've seen their relatives, and this is what happened, this is what happened with
Yeah.
everybody. So,
it,
well,
it's
but
it
let's,
Yeah.
yeah,
Go ahead.
let's go to your story, my friend. Let's go to your
Okay.
story. If you don't mind, we can go with a little bit of backstory a bit if you want, and then you tell me about what happened and when you realized that that was your NDE. Because at how old you were? 1 year infant.
I was actually 6 months old when
Okay,
it happened.
okay.
So this is what makes kind of my story just a little bit different than a lot of the people who have had near death experiences. Um, because I didn't know that I had had a near death experience growing up. Um, I had lived in some very unusual places growing up that should have given me clues that something had happened at a young age, because I had been experiencing very interesting, if not supernatural, events in my life as a young boy. Um, I'll just give you a real quick example of one, which is that when I was roughly around 6 or 7, I was my family moved around a lot, and so we moved to this house, and that house became what I later on referred to as the hauntings, because of all of the paranormal activity that went on in that house. And if you can imagine anything that's paranormal happening, it basically happened in that house. And I talk about this. I wrote a book. It's called The Closet Spiritualist, and I talk about this at the beginning of the book because it was the first real experience I had that I can remember. I did have some other ones, but not as profound as this. It was the first experience that I had with the supernatural, the paranormal, and more importantly, it was also the first time that I had really been exposed to this sort of collective voice that I would hear later on in my life forever. Okay. At that time, that collective voice was for me like a little boy. It was like having an imaginary friend, or like an angel guardian. But it wasn't just one. It was like many, many voices that would speak to me. At that age, I thought it was just pretty normal to have that. I didn't question it. And living in a house where so many unusual things were happening, I just assumed that was the way life was.
And how old you were, if I can ask you, at that
Yeah, at
time?
that time I was about when we moved into this house, I was about 6 years old, and we stayed
Okay,
there until I was about 11.
okay.
And
So
and
five.
it's kind of like one of those bad movies, right, Sergey, where you kind of wonder why people would stay 5 years in a house like that. I don't know. I mean, my parents were the ones, that decided to stay, but it was extraordinarily unusual.
But did your parents, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. I'm curious. Did your parents or anybody else in your family sense that, or you were the only one? And were you sharing that with them?
No, actually, everybody sensed it. Everybody experienced it.
Okay,
Um,
all
it,
right.
it was it was hard not to, because there were a lot of moments. There were, like I said, very unusual. My brother, in particular, one of my brothers in particular, had experienced what some people would call sort of a minor possession of the body, several times, and we had an exorcism performed in our house several times, and we at the time we had actually petitioned the Roman Catholic Church because we were Catholic, and we had attempted to try to have it done by somebody in Rome, but that request was denied. It was all sorts of things. You just can't imagine. I mean, it was just so many things that was going on, and they were very powerful things. So it was an experience that my entire family could account for, relate to, and it left an impression on all of us after we left that house, to say the least. My brother was the one that had the most early on. He was the most exposed to it, and because of that, it left a lot of long lasting impressions on him. For me, it was more of having this experience where I saw it, I experienced it as an observer, I saw and heard things that are very unusual, but it was mostly the voice. It was the voice that I kept hearing throughout this time. Pretty much every night, I would go to bed, and this voice, which was kind of like I said, it felt like a voice, but it was like there was more than just one entity around it. And it was always telling me, "Don't worry, they won't hurt you. Your light shines too brightly." That's all they would say. And so I was like, okay. I was 5, 6. I was 6, 7, 8 years old. I didn't. As long as they said that, it was like I was fine. So I never really had the direct experience of having sort of the negative aspects of that happen, but it was extraordinarily unusual. And there's other parts to that story that later on came out, which is that in that home there had been a little girl years before we moved into that home, and she had committed suicide, and she had died by suicide, and she back then she had clairvoyant skills too, and she was I'm not sure what the exact term is, but she was one of those beings that had the ability to bring people into the light, and they were lost and couldn't get into the light, and so she had that shine that allowed them to go through her into the light. And nobody understood her situation, from what I understand, and eventually her father had locked her up in the attic a lot, and he had his own issues. He was an alcoholic, and she committed suicide. And so there was a lot of energy there in that house. And when I came into that house, since I had the shine, I sort of reactivated a lot of that. And so it was a very interesting 5 years, to say the least. And so now I'm 4 years after that. I'm about 15, 16 years old, and I'm trying to move on with my life. It was pretty easy. I'm a kid, I'm just moving on, thinking that's all in the past. And I started to have visions and dreams. When I say visions, most of my visions came early in the morning. So I would wake up, and you know how we're very lucid when we're waking up,
Yeah.
and I would just lay there in bed, and I would have these images of an event, kind of like a scene in a movie. And this also occurred in my dreams, but in this event, I was in a hospital, and it was always the same hospital. It was always the same people. My mother was there, and my aunt was there, and several other people were there, and they were doing a vigil around this little baby in an incubator. And I remember that the hospital was not like the hospitals in the States. Okay, it was older and more run down, and it felt more like it was somewhere else. And later on, the somewhere else was in South America, which is where I was born. And so anyway, I immediately felt this sort of connection with the baby in the incubator, and it didn't take very long for me to associate that connection with the fact that I was seeing myself as a baby. And I remember that I could feel energy. To me, it was all about energy. I didn't really need to hear what was being said. It was more, to me, the connection was more important with the feelings that I was feeling, and the feelings that I was getting in the room, and the frequencies of the room. So anyway, in this vision, I saw my mother. She was much younger, and she was sitting on the bed near the incubator, and I sat next to her, and I just knew she wasn't aware of me, but I was completely aware of her feelings. And I remember that at that moment, a couple of doctors came in, and they had asked her to just step outside, and to talk to her. So the reason I was in the hospital was because earlier that day, and actually before the day before, I started to experience a real hard time breathing. I was coughing a lot. And so my mother wanted to make sure I was okay. She thought I had a bad chest cold, but it turns out I had a real bad case of pneumonia. And so they asked her or told her that I needed to stay overnight to make sure that they could observe and make sure that I was okay. So that happened in the afternoon, and by later in the day, by the early evening hours, I was really turning for the worse. And the doctors came in, and this is where my vision really kicked in. Okay, and they told her that it looked like my situation was progressing much more severely than they thought, and they didn't think I was going to make it through the night. In fact, they felt like if I was lucky, I might live maybe several hours more. And so they asked her if it would be okay if they would provide a priest or a chaplain to come in and pray with the family and be with the family. And I remember that I was standing just to the left of my mother when she was hearing this, and I could feel how her consciousness energy, she just checked out. She didn't even hear the words anymore. She just went into this sort of trance. And she picked up, after she listened to the doctors and agreed to have the priest come in, she went into the room and she gathered her stuff and she left the hospital. And which I found, in the time that I was having this dream, I found that to be very interesting, because I would think that she would want to be there with me for the last few hours. But instead, my mother was a very devout Catholic, and so she did what she felt was needed at the time. And so she left. There was a church not very far away from the hospital, and she went there to pray. And when she got to about a block away from the church, she got on her knees and she crawled all the way to the church, and she went up the church on her knees up to the front to the altar. And when she sat down to pray, it changed. Her energy changed again. And I remember that it wasn't much of a prayer as it was just this opportunity for her to, in almost a meditative state, she was very grateful that she had the time, even though it was only 6 months, with me. I remember that surprised me, because I was expecting her to sit there and do what most people would do, probably cry and ask for me to be safe. But instead, she just was filled with so much gratitude.
Wow.
And I remember being so full of that gratitude myself and appreciation that I could feel her emotions, and in my vision I was starting to cry because it was so beautiful. And after she was done with that, it was though something had happened in her conscious stream, because I remember that the energy in the room changed again, and it was as though it had stopped, and she started to see visions in her meditation. And what she saw was all these visions of me growing up and getting married and being the father, the son, the husband that she always dreamt she would experience. But I could feel that she wasn't the one producing these visions. She was receiving them. And she was so full of joy. She was so full of joy that she was able to see this. And so here again, the energy changed. And when the visions, when these pictures stopped, she had a state of peace and calmness to her. And it was as though she could go back to the hospital, and she was prepared to receive whatever information, and she would be okay with it. So she did. She went back to the hospital, And when she got there at the front door, the doctors and the family members were there, and she thought she was going to be told that I had passed away
Mm-hmm.
because everybody was crying. But instead, they told her that in the time that she was gone, there had been this miracle, and that I was fine. My vitals were coming back. My organs that were shutting down were no longer shutting down. And in fact, I was able to go back. I was able to go home the next day. And you know, doctors, a lot of times when they have these things happen, especially way back then, they just called it a medical miracle, and they left it at that. That was it. Um, Now, there was also a second part to my visions and to my dreams, and that was that I saw myself after I had left my body. And so these were two distinct visions and dreams, and they were happening at the same time during the same period of time. And there I saw myself detaching myself from this little baby's body and being in the room, but kind of elevated at the top, watching everything. And then all of a sudden, for some reason I still really don't quite understand, I found myself in this huge space of sand. It was a desert. I was in the desert. And I remember that I was still elevated, and I could look down and I saw these people, and they were looking at me. And they had their hands stretched out as if they were asking for something. And I thought at first they were just doing something to get my attention because I didn't understand. But then I realized they weren't looking at me. They were looking through me. And behind me was this enormous light. And I remember looking up at it, and I remember thinking to myself, the first thing I thought was, well, why doesn't it hurt? You know, like when you look directly into the sun, you have to squint and look away. This thing was like 10 times bigger than the sun, and it didn't hurt. It was warm. It was really warm, but it was super bright. And I looked down, and the people were still gazing at this light. And so when I looked up again, this light was literally coming over me. And when it came over me, I remember that I remember feeling every part of my body, and my body was very different. It felt very light, and it didn't feel like it was very translucent. Okay. And so I remember feeling my cells vibrating. They were like vibrating rapidly. And it was as though the cells were aware of this light, and were thirsty for the light too. And it was really strange because I felt myself feeling that thirst, but I also felt myself feeling it as all parts of my body, all my cells. I felt all of that. So anyway, I went into the light as like most people would describe it. And when I was in the light, I was overwhelmed by everywhere. There were all of these individual beings. And I knew them. I actually felt like I knew every one of them. But I'm telling you, Sergei, there must have been an infinite number of beings there. And I knew that they knew me, and I felt this sense of love for all of them, and they had this sense of love for me. And in that moment, there were like 3 or 4 of them that came close to me, and they didn't have a body like the way that we have bodies. They didn't have any specific body features, but I knew them. I mean, I really knew them. I knew them to be like my family. I knew them as family, but it wasn't my family here. It was like my family from very, very far away, from somewhere way beyond here. And they circled me, and they gave me this massive hug. And in the book, I called it the million hugs. But Sergei, I tell you, it was more than a million hugs. It felt explosive. At that moment, my cells again began to vibrate very, very, very rapidly. And here's the really crazy thing. If all of this isn't already crazy, but the crazy thing was is that I felt myself in each cell. I saw 50 trillion me's that knew me as my body, and we were all experiencing this incredible blissful feeling. And then at that moment, this energy just surged through me, and I literally exploded into light. And you can imagine at that point, I didn't want to go anywhere. I wanted to stay there. There was no way I wanted to come back to this world. And I knew I felt like I wasn't there to stay. I was there to just experience this, because there was a moment after that explosion where I felt this. There was always this kind of entity around me, and it never said anything verbally. It was all telepathic. And I remember that they said to me, what do you see? And I thought that was really interesting, because I'm like, what do you mean, what do I see? I'm feeling all this stuff, and you're asking me, what do I see? And I remember I didn't really acknowledge that question right away, and they kept asking and asking and asking, which was really typical of the way they would always communicate with me later on in life. And so I stopped. Just in that moment, I stopped what I was doing, and I looked around and I looked around, and all of a sudden it hit me. It hit me what they were trying to show me, because in some way, shape, or form, they wanted me to remember this. And you and I were talking a little bit before I got on, and I was saying that everything we do is to remember. And so right at that moment, I felt this energy on my shoulder, and before I knew it, I was like whisked back, like in that tunnel that everybody talks about. It was just like it was like lightning, all of these different colors that I couldn't even describe. And the next thing I know, I'm landing on my body. I really felt like I landed on my body, and I look around, and this whole thing happened at least a half a dozen times during this period. And each time I woke up, I would always be disoriented, and I would always feel this sadness, because I didn't want to be back. I wanted to stay there. And so I would start crying, like crying. And so eventually I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't just hold this story in. I had to tell somebody. And so my mother was one of the main characters, obviously, in my story. So I asked her, I said, look, I'm I know we just had these 5 crazy years of hauntings. Something else is going on, and I need to tell you. And so I did, and I told her everything I saw, every conversation she had, every feeling she had, the vision that she had when she was in the church of me growing up. And her mouth just dropped, and she said, "How do you know this?" She goes, "I've never, ever shared any of this with anybody." And then that's when she told me, she goes, you died when you were 6 months old, but I never shared it with you because it wasn't, at the time it was important, but as you were growing up, it just seemed less important. So we figured one day we would tell you, but it didn't always seem like there was ever a good time to tell you. Well, she told me, she said that this is how I died, and it was exactly the way I had remembered it in the visions. But more importantly, she was just stunned at the fact that I told her things about what had happened that nobody else could have ever known, because they were in her mind, in her prayers, in the moments that she was by herself. So she wanted me to share it. Sergei, who am I going to share this with? I'm 15 years old. This is back before anybody.
They're gonna lock you up at 15.
Yes, that's just it, man. I was not going to share this with anybody because of the hauntings that we had. and what it did to our family, and how it did eventually affect some of my family members, and they did experience some of that trauma of being treated differently because of it. There was no way I was going to share this with anybody, so I just kept it to myself. But what happened was that over the years, and I talk about this in the book, I had so many supernatural events that just kept piling up and piling up and piling up. And it was really creating a spiritual crisis for me. And eventually I had to deal with that. And that happened 12 years ago in my first awakening. And ever since then, I've never been able to look back. I accepted my clairvoyant abilities, and I brought back the messages that I needed to bring back from that experience. And I started telling my story, which is how the book was created.
Oh my gosh, I have like five pages of questions. You see, I'm making notes.
I saw that. Yeah.
I didn't want to rip them off because it's gonna show up on my microphone here, but now I'm gonna cut it out. I don't know where to start. First of all, I'm gonna tell you this: I had goosebumps the whole time you've been talking. I had goosebumps
Oh, wow. Thank
all the
you.
time because I can feel. Now, you said you've been in and out like a dozen times. And this is at the same time while your mother was praying and being in that gratitude state, right?
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
you were pulled and then coming back. And it's like you had a purpose here to fulfill. You wanted to come back because it's so beautiful and you were happy and all these zillions of happy souls and all this family over there. But then you had this, you probably you had to be with your mother. She was so grateful, and you had to come back to be with her, one, and then maybe come back and tell this story. And I'm probably sure you have tons of stories, but
Yeah, I do actually. I have a lot more than you probably could fill
I,
in this interview, but there is another interesting part to this that don't I up until very recently wasn't sharing very much with, because part of it was I just felt like it wasn't as relevant for people to know, but I feel now that it has become pretty relevant. Um, when I crossed over, and when I was in the light, as with most people who are in that moment, if they have the choice, which they usually do because that's why they come back, or maybe they don't want to come back and they're told they have to come back. Um, in that moment, there was a decision that I had to make, and that decision was to stay or not. And I said to you that I felt like I wasn't going to be able to stay anyway. That's not entirely true. Um, so what I realized years later is that I'm what you referred to as a walk-in. And a walk-in is a spirit that takes the body of the deceased and lives the life of that body. And the deceased, in this case, the child that was there, the baby that was there, the spirit that was in that baby, did choose to stay. And in that moment, gave permission to the walk in, this aspect of me, to live its life here. Because the walk in has typically, like most walk ins, does have a purpose, a very specific purpose for coming back. That's the only way that a walk in can come back. And so it took a long time for me to accept that piece of it. I mean, look, I was trying to grasp all of this at a time when nobody was talking about it. And on top of that, I was hearing voices. I had just lived in hauntings. All these other supernatural events were going on in my life. And now I'm being told that I'm actually a walk-in, which means I wasn't the original spirit in that body, and that I had other purposes for being here. So it was a lot to chew. It was a lot to
a
chew.
lot to chew, a lot to chew. I got 10 pages here. I don't know. We'll have to make another couple more podcasts for all this. I'm gonna save all these pages. But let me ask you this: do you know the walk-in?
Do I know that? Yes, I actually do know who I am as a walk-in. Yes.
Okay. Do you want to
Um,
share what? I mean, it's a secret. Whatever you feel like.
this
Yeah.
is this is this is the part that you've never asked. No one's ever asked that question, so I thought I could avoid it.
Okay.
Um, so walk-ins typically do not evolve the way that other spiritual beings evolve. And what I mean by that is spiritual beings evolve through a process of these type of schools that allow them to experience aspects of themselves, to not necessarily learn, but to experience what they are not. Okay, so the school, I call it a school, this Earth school, is a place where you get to experience what you are not, the world of contrast, and you evolve as you experience. You grow, and when you grow, your consciousness evolves, and as and you expand as God. Okay, that's kind of the simple way. I'm hoping that makes sense. That's what most spiritual light beings do. Okay, in my case, a walk-in comes directly from Source, from God, and they would be in other times they would be um, angels, or archangels, or even prophets, and they come directly from Source to bring messages back to humanity.
Oh my God! Now I'm asking you a little bit stupid questions. Why these archangels or angels don't incarnate, don't walk into our politicians
Into our bodies? You mean into bodies?
and to the politicians?
Oh, into
you know.
that's a good question, man. Because the energy is too dense, too dense.
Probably the vibrations are so low they can't even get
Yeah,
in. That's impossible.
it's impossible, man. It would take too much energy to get into them.
Yeah, that
Yes.
was that was off topic, but I just
No,
wanted to
I
make it
loved
sure.
it though. You caught me off guard.
Yeah,
I laughed.
yeah. Oh my gosh, I don't know what to start asking you questions here. 1 second, let me
Yeah,
hear.
that's why, before we got on, I said, I love telling my story, um, but there's so much to my
Right,
story.
it's so much. It's so much. You can start anywhere. You can make an hour podcast with
Oh, yeah.
every question. I think because I didn't even ask you any questions. We already have 45 minutes here,
Yeah.
but I can. I
No,
was
right.
thinking.
Well, yeah, exactly. We
I
have,
didn't even ask you.
we barely said our hellos,
Right,
and
right,
we're
right.
already through half of the
Yeah.
podcast. So, you could ask any question, start anywhere, because that's what I really enjoy the most is just anything you want
Okay,
to
let's
ask.
let's go back to the paranormal activity in that house.
Yes.
Now, okay, you were a kid, you didn't know what's going on, you don't. But why your parents did not move? Because that was crazy. I mean, I would move right away next day.
You know, that's probably the one area that I never really got to explore very much with my family. Um, the question of why. Why did we stay as
Right.
long as we did? Um, my parents and my family at the time were going through a tremendous amount of just difficulty in the marriage process, and my father was also an alcoholic, and my mother did everything she could to raise us and to provide for us, and she was never home a lot of this time. She was there, but she was very rarely there most of the time. um, so I don't know if she really experienced it as much as the kids did. I mean, there's no doubt that she experienced it. There were many events where she was involved in some of the craziness that went on in that house. And then what happened because of that, the therapy sessions that happened because of this. I really don't. I honestly, Sergey, I don't know why they stayed so long. Other than I do know in the bigger picture, in what I know now in terms of how this reality works, um, those events had to happen. I had to
Right.
experience all of those events so that someday I would understand how they relate to the bigger picture of what
Yeah.
this whole reality is all about. So I don't regret it because it was extraordinary experience. And it really helped me. It was, like I said, where I got introduced to this voice, the collective consciousness that later on in my life would become Caleb.
Caleb. Okay, so that's the name of the voice that is talking to you. It's a
Yes.
collective voice, or it's just
Yes.
one? It's a collective.
No,
So it's
it's
like,
many.
so they channel through you, or
Yes.
okay. So you do the
Yeah.
channeling. You do the channeling sessions for someone.
I have students, and
Okay.
I work with them to wake up, to who they are as divinity, and I will channel much of that with them. But it's interesting, Sergey, because my channeling is much different. It's not like I have to get into a deep meditative state
Hmm.
to do it. I don't sit there and I don't all of a sudden go, and change my voice and talk, because this happened to me at such a young age, as I was developing as a human being. It all just kind of got worked into my neural system. And so for me, channeling it's always happening. It's
Yeah.
I mean, if for instance you started asking me questions about the universe, um, boom, I just they just take over, and you wouldn't know the difference really, but I could get very deep with that discussion.
Um, or is that Caleb telling this story right
Caleb,
now in the 40? Caleb.
yeah,
Caleb. Caleb. Was he telling this story right now in the 45 minutes we've been talking?
together
Caleb?
we were doing it.
Together.
Yes,
Okay, because it was amazing. I'm telling this is why I had these goosebumps. Now,
yes.
maybe in the next interview, if we do one, we'll do a channeling session if you like. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, again, the challenge session would be just let's go deep together. Let's
yeah,
just go deep together and just ask me anything that you want to
right.
ask me, and I will give you answers to it in a way that are very intimate. They are very deep and broad in scope. Um, so it's I used to do readings and stuff with people, not very often, because I could easily change the frequency and talk to somebody from the other side. But most of my work now is just using the collective to tap into the Akashic records, the field, the stream,
Yeah,
and just using that to help students and people to remember who they are, just expand it. So what happens in a lot of cases is I just talk, they'll share a little bit of their story with me. I listen, but I also listen to their spirit, their soul, and I will feel the vibrations, and then I could speak to their. I tell them that I speak directly to their soul, and then we just discuss things. It's not about reading into the future or looking into the past. I speak to their soul to help their soul wake up.
yeah. It's not like, okay, give me the six numbers for the lottery. It's
Yeah,
not like that. Okay,
no,
I know.
no. I
Here's a,
mean, I,
here's
I,
a,
I would have
okay.
done that myself.
It's like, okay, I'm going to give you 50%. Just give me the six numbers.
Yeah, no, I wish.
Yeah,
So it's really different. That's why you got goosebumps, because what one does when they tap in is you learn how to play with the frequency of somebody, connecting with somebody's soul, and it sends a vibration that
yeah.
makes it feel like goosebumps.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That happens when you see something really extraordinary, beautiful,
Exactly.
or you have a real love, or you are astonished by something amazing. Because
Yes.
we don't get goosebumps when we are in fear. Mostly when we are amazed by something that speaks
Yes.
to our soul directly.
Yes.
You know.
Exactly. You
Yeah,
hit it right on the head of the nail.
yeah.
Exactly.
So you felt all these abilities in yourself since you were a kid and teenager. But when did you? did you come out of the spiritual closet? When did you start telling about this? I know you wrote a book in 2020. It took you a
Yes.
while, but
Um,
yeah.
so it my life has been full of events, and that's why I was asking you about your friend. And did your friend have an event, or was it a near death experience?
I can tell you, yeah, after you answer the question, I'll tell you what happened to him. Yeah.
Okay, so um, for me, there were beyond just the hauntings, there were events in my life that were happening that made it really difficult for me to deny that I had something happening to me that was beyond the ordinary. And in the book, I talk about this one specific event, but there were many events where I was traveling with my family to Arizona, and and we had just had a family. I mean, we had two children at the time, and they were one was a baby like in a car seat, and the other one was like 2 years old. And I went to go get the rental car, and and in the Phoenix airport, as with most airports, there's like 3 lanes, usually 3 or 4 lanes
Yeah.
that you can swerve around and find a spot, and you pick up people and then you take off. But there's also extra lanes so that the buses and other taxis or whatever Ubers can go by. And I had missed my entrance to go pick them up, so I had to go through the public transport area. And so where I wound up parking, I was very far away from where my wife was coming out with the kids. But I was close enough that when they came out, I saw them, and I yelled for them, and my son heard me, but my wife didn't. And and so my son was 2, and he was holding her hand, and he didn't know any better. He saw me, so he let go of her hand and started running toward me. And at that moment, I saw, and I was far away enough that I was like, there's no way I'm going to be able to stop him, run out and stop him, because it just wouldn't have happened. In the distance, I saw there were many cars actually coming, and they were coming in pretty fast. And I knew he was going to die if I didn't do something. And so at that moment, I had this very sort of unusual reaction, and that was I just for some reason I just closed my eyes and I went really deep inside. I felt like my consciousness went deep, but I didn't know I was doing this. Okay, I just remember back, and I remember I went deep inside, and at that moment I screamed out and I said no, but I really screamed out the no. And when that happened, I saw the vibration of my no, and it was hitting everything in the airport, the planes, the cars, the buildings, the people. I could see it hitting off as a vibration. And when it hit off of the buildings and the people and everything stopped. Everything just came to a complete standstill. Even the air, even the noise. There was no more noise. It was all completely stopped. But even what was even crazier was that when it hit off of these buildings and stuff, I could see the vibration hit off of them as a wave. Kind of like when you see in the movies when there's an earthquake, you could see the wave of it even through the concrete. Everything was wavy. And everything all of a sudden went from 3D to 2D. It just went right back on the screen. And I remember going like, what's going on? And it went back to 2D. It was as if I could see the whole screen of everything everywhere. And then just a few moments later, and there was something else that happened before that, but a few moments later, that 2D image went back to 3D. But while I was experiencing this whole thing lasted about, I don't know, somewhere around 10 seconds maybe. And so when I experienced that, I all of a sudden felt my consciousness stream into the car that was the closest to him. And I was sitting in the back seat of the car, and I was screaming no to the driver and to the passenger. and I saw them, and there was a young lady and her boyfriend, and they were far enough away that I should not have that vivid memory of who they were. But he hits the dashboard. She slams on the brakes, hits herself on the wheel and the steering wheel, and then all of a sudden I go back into my body again. And as soon as she slams the brakes and I got back into my body, that 2D image went back to being 3D, and then all of a sudden everything started again. And the cars were all at a standstill, and my son runs across the street. I give him a big hug, and I didn't want to acknowledge what had just happened because all I cared about was that he was safe. But that memory just kept coming back and back and back over and over again, because what I didn't realize at that moment was that I somehow accessed the field, and I was able to see how consciousness affects the third dimensional reality we live in, that we call this reality world. I got to see what Caleb later on would describe as the game. How do things go from 2D to 3D to 2D to 3D? I got to see that for the first time. It was as if I got to peek on the other side of this whole thing, and it just never left me. I just could never forget that moment. And I had moments like this later on in my life, multiple times, but that was the first time I had ever experienced what people would call the Matrix.
Yeah, wow. Again, I'm coming back to my goosebumps here, but let me tell you about my friend. You said it was an incident. He was in a courtroom divorcing his wife. His wife, 4 children, left him. He was working somewhere in Europe, overseas, working hard to provide for his family, and his wife decided to divorce him. When he came back, she told him, and they went to court. And while he was in court listening to all these accusations, which were not true, against him, he got a stroke.
Ooh,
Yeah, and
wow.
he fell, lost consciousness. And this is when he got on the body, and he remembers because they were driving in the ambulance, and he saw the ambulance, he saw himself, he saw everything that happened around. And when they brought him into the emergency room, he looked like, I'm not interested in the body. I gotta get out of here, And he left, and he started traveling, and suddenly he saw this big light, big figure. Like it's kind of trivial story here. Big light, like an angel or something,
Yeah.
standing far. I was first from the ground. A little pin of light start coming out. It's like fireworks, but big fireworks, and he formed this figure over there, and he was traveling towards his figure, and he thought it was God, but who knows?
Yeah.
And he came, and he traveled so fast, and he was so happy to get out of the body, and he said, "No, it's not your time." Like all the stories. You have to come back, and everything is going to be different now. You're going to have a new life right now. And he's like, very short, but I mean, amazing. It's just,
It was very transformative. How can you not
yeah.
have your life has to change just from having that experience?
And it changed right away. Like next week or something after that, he met a woman on the street. They fall in love. They got married. They moved
Wow.
overseas. They're working together right now. It's just amazing. His life changed. And he's so
Yeah.
happy. Yeah.
That's cool. What I wanted to tell you before we came on was that that more and more people are having not just near death experiences, but all these spiritually transformative experiences, and all of them can be significantly well, that's why they call them transformative, because it changes your life almost instantaneously. Um, in my case, I was very stubborn. I didn't want to experience that, where I was very confused with my life at that time, because nothing was making sense to me. And there was something else that I really wanted to share about that experience. One of the things that really stuck with me, Sergei, was that was that when everything came back on, when the noise came back and everything went back to 3D in the airport, what was really, really, really fascinating to me, I mean, it just stuck in my head, was that I remember I was looking at my wife and kids and the people around them. Everybody had stopped, like in the movie, right? It was just dead still.
You're right. I see it
And then
very
all of
cinematic. Yeah.
yeah, and then all of a sudden, like in the movie, they start up again. And nobody, not one person came to us and said, "Is he okay? Are you all right? Is everything going to be all right? Can I help you?" They were they 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 just went on with their life as if nothing had happened. So it wasn't just that I experienced the way third dimensional reality works in this simulation, but I realized there was something different about the way the people had reacted. And so that was also the first time that I was introduced to what some people might, who are listening to this, they know this phenomenon as the digital people or the backdrop people. It was the first time that I had experienced the roboticness of the game. And that part I will always remember.
Digital people interesting. I never heard that.
Yeah.
But you describing this incident, I see it as a very powerful short film right there.
Yes.
Everything just comes to the stop and there is silence and that is just happening slow motion,
Yes.
and then comes back and like nothing happens, but the event already happened.
Yeah,
It's a very powerful short film.
I've been told that many parts of my life could be a good movie,
Right.
because it's just full of these kind of supernatural events now that people are so intrigued about, and really have these qualities of something much greater than just these typical, even paranormal stuff that people know about already. It's like we're touching into something great, and that's what
Yeah.
it is. We're tapping into something where you can actually stop time
Right.
and space, and it's the stuff that movies are made of now.
Well, when I'm talking to you, actually with other NDE experiencers, some of them, I feel this like the time stopped sometimes. I'm right in that moment and I enjoy it so much. And me, I don't position myself as an awakened person or something, but I feel sometimes that I'm a channel for these stories.
Yes.
Because these stories, people just talking about them. Okay, you wrote a book. Many people don't write books. They just want to share and they share it. And through me, I bring it into a digital audio video format
Yeah.
and kind of spread the knowledge through the easy channel because not everybody wants to read a book. Not everybody has time. You know how it is with the
Right.
books.
No, I get you. I get you.
Audio book, yeah. And this is somehow a little bit of audio book right here.
Right.
But so I feel like somewhat of a channel here too, if I may.
Well, yeah, and I would agree with you. That's why before we started, I asked you, what got you into this, and your friend's experience got to. But there's more to that. I will tell you that many of my interviews with people that have shows like yours, they not really. It's rare that any of them have had an experience in NDE, but they're so drawn to it. It's as though they feel like they have a purpose to get this information out, and in many cases they themselves are either in the process or they will soon have what I call a massive awakening, and
Yeah,
so this whole experience is preparing them
right.
for that time.
Yeah, you have to be prepared for that because if you are in very low vibration and you get the awakening, the wiring can just burn. You
Oh
have to
yeah,
be prepared. Yeah.
you have to be prepared.
So
Yes.
prepared, yeah. All right, my friend. I think this might be okay for the first interview. I'm really hoping we're going to do more, but
I
let me
would love
ask.
that. I would
Yeah,
love
yeah,
that.
yeah. We're going to do that. Now, I'm going to ask you a question about your book and about what people can find more about
Oh
you,
sure.
about your work, and if you can share that.
Yeah, I think the easiest place is to go to my website, and that's The Closet Spiritualist. I always have to stress the because there is a website that is just Closet Spiritualist,
Yeah.
but it's the Closet Spiritualist, named after the book, .com, and they can get information on where they can access the book, and how to access me. As I say, I work a lot with people who, as students, they take a course. It's called The Way of the Inner Child, and the reason why it's called that is because there is a significance to that frequency. Um, there are a lot of sacred books, a lot of sacred traditions and teachings, that talk about the power of the child. There are a lot of references to how one cannot receive or enter into the kingdom of heaven or into the unknown, as it would be said in some Eastern traditions, unless you have the energy, unless you receive it as a child. And that's not, Sergei, some kind of metaphor. That is a frequency, and it's a simple frequency of innocence and wonderment and all sorts of things, that I teach, and it's something that many of the great masters taught, but it's just been forgotten until now.
Well, if I may put my 5 cents here about the inner child, you know, children like to read. Well, when I was young, we didn't have no TV. I saw the first TV when I was 14 years old. We had no TV.
Wow.
Yeah, I grew up very poor. We didn't have that. But anyway, I was reading a lot of books. When I was 5 years old, I started going to the library and getting books. I was reading a lot. Most of them were fairy tales.
Mm, mm, mm,
And
mm.
right now, I beginning to understand that the fairy tales were not fairy tales.
They're not.
It was all true. This is why children are so innocent and they are so much drawn to these fairy tales and also to nice cartoons as well,
Yep.
because these are all voices from the other side. Some people, they're authors and painters and artists, um, they could not confess that they've been to another side. They could not say
Yes.
that. It was dangerous. So they
Yes.
wrote these fairy tales. It's okay.
Yes.
This is my imagination, guys. I'm just an imaginative person. This is what I say. I'm just an artist. I'm coming up with all this stuff for you. But they were telling the truth,
They
you
were
know.
telling the truth. And Sergey, that's more than just 5 cents that you just got me. You gave people, because that's why this I call it a frequency, just because it's the only word that can help people understand a little bit. This teaching, this practice that I do with students, is to tap into that frequency, that ability to open a lock with a key to the other side, that is very simple, but we just have forgotten how to do it. And but if you remember, and if you can tap into it, the world changes, like that, instantaneously, for people, creativity and otherwise. It's enormous, and imagination is a big piece of that. It's We get told as a little kid, you can imagine, but after a while, forget that stuff.
Yeah.
So the way of the inner child was actually, Yeshua taught it, Buddha taught it, all these great masters taught it, and that was one of the things that I came back with from my near death experience.
Beautiful. Well, there's so much to talk about here, my friend, but we'll be concluding this podcast for now. I don't want to make it too long, but it's already over 1 hour, which we planned. So I would like to thank you very much, and so nice to meet you, my friend. And I hope we're going to meet in the future and talk more about this.
Likewise, Sergey. I look forward to it.
Thank you. Thanks for watching About Freedom Show. I really appreciate you. Please subscribe, and thanks again for your support.